It was a warm Thursday evening in Ridgefield, Virginia, the kind of evening where porch lights flicker on one by one, and the smell of charcoal grills drifts down quiet suburban streets. At the corner of Maple and 9th, two 17-year-old girls were walking home from soccer practice. Identical twins, same braided hair, same green duffel bags slung over their shoulders, same laugh that carried down the block, like it had carried down that block 1,000 times before. Their names were Amara and Zuri Whitfield. By the time the sun went down that night, their names would be known across the entire country. Nobody on Maple Street knew, as those two girls crossed the intersection laughing about a missed penalty kick, that in exactly 4 minutes, one of them would be lying on the pavement, and a police officer's entire career, along with the reputation of an entire department, would collapse in the time it takes to pull a trigger twice. Nobody knew that 6 miles away, in an office on Pennsylvania Avenue, their father was reviewing a briefing folder, completely unaware that his phone was about to ring with the worst call of his life. And nobody, least of all the officer sitting in his patrol car outside a convenience store 2 blocks away, had any idea that the badge he carried was about to collide head-on with one of the most powerful legal offices in the United States government. This is the story of a routine walk home, a split-second decision made by a man who should have known better, a father whose title carried more weight than any officer on that street could have imagined, and a small suburban intersection that, by morning, would be surrounded by news vans from every major network in the country. This is the story of what happens when power, prejudice, and a father's love collide on an ordinary Thursday evening, and why, sometimes, the person you least expect to be watching is exactly the person who changes everything. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand who Marcus Whitfield was long before he ever held the title of Attorney General of the United States. He was born in a 2-bedroom apartment in East Baltimore, the 4th of 6 children raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a hospital custodian. Marcus remembers the sound of that apartment better than almost anything else from his childhood. The hum of a window unit air conditioner that never quite worked, the creak of the pull-out couch he shared with his younger brother, the sound of his mother's keys in the door at 11 p.m., exhausted but always asking about his homework before she asked about anything else. "Education is the one thing they can't take from you," she used to tell him. "Everything else they can take, not that." Marcus took that lesson and ran with it, literally, at times, since running track was the only extracurricular his family could afford, and it happened to be the thing that got him noticed by a guidance counselor who helped him apply for a scholarship to a magnet high school across town. From there, it was a scholarship to Howard University, then a partial scholarship to Georgetown Law, paid for in part by nights spent working security at a downtown office building, memorizing case law between rounds of checking IDs. He graduated in the top 5% of his class. He could have gone anywhere: corporate law, a 6-figure starting salary, the kind of life his mother used to dream about for him out loud while she folded laundry. Instead, he took a job as a public defender in a Baltimore courthouse that hadn't been renovated since the Nixon administration, representing clients who couldn't afford anyone else, sleeping 4 hours a night while he built cases nobody else wanted to take. "I do what it looks like from the outside when the system fails somebody," he said in a law school commencement speech years later. "I grew up watching it fail people I loved. I didn't become a lawyer to make peace with that system. I became a lawyer to fix it from inside the room where the decisions get made." He climbed, assistant district attorney in Baltimore, then a federal prosecutor, where he built a reputation for taking on public corruption cases nobody else wanted to touch, including, at one point, a sitting state senator who tried to have him removed from a case through back-channel political pressure. Marcus didn't budge. The senator was convicted 18 months later. Then came Deputy Attorney General. Then, 3 years before the events of this story, a phone call from the White House. Marcus remembers exactly where he was standing when he got that call. In his kitchen, still in his work clothes, his daughters doing homework at the counter behind him. He remembers turning around after he hung up and seeing 8-year-old Amara and Zuri staring up at him, waiting to hear if the call was good news or bad news. "Girls," he told them, "your dad is going to have a very big, very boring new job title. But I promise you, nothing at home changes. You're still doing your own dishes." 3 months later, Marcus Whitfield was sworn in as the 87th Attorney General of the United States, standing in the Rose Garden, his hand on a Bible held by his wife, his daughters standing just behind him in matching yellow dresses. He was, by every measure, one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. And from the very first day, he made a decision that would define how he ran his household for the next 3 years. His daughters would not grow up surrounded by federal agents. No black SUVs outside their school. No security detail trailing them to soccer practice. No metal detectors at their front door. "The day my girls need federal protection to walk down their own street," he told his chief of staff during his first week in office, "is the day this country has already failed them. I refuse to raise my daughters like prisoners of my own job." His wife, Dr. Elena Whitfield, a pediatric surgeon at a children's hospital just outside D.C., agreed completely. She had her own version of the same philosophy. She still worked 12-hour shifts, still drove a used minivan with 90,000 miles on it, still made the girls do their own laundry even after Marcus's title changed everything else about their lives. Amara and Zuri grew up, as much as possible, like any other kids in Ridgefield, Virginia. They went to public school, they played travel soccer, they fought over the bathroom in the morning, and argued about whose turn it was to load the dishwasher. Amara was the more outspoken twin, team captain material, quick with a comeback, the one who organized their friend group's group chats. Zuri was quieter, more observant, the one who noticed things other people missed, who wanted to study environmental law one day because she'd become obsessed with a documentary about coral reefs in 7th grade. Neither of them ever introduced themselves as the Attorney General's daughters. Most of their friends' parents didn't even know what Marcus Whitfield did for a living until they saw him on the news. That was exactly how Marcus wanted it, and for 3 years it worked perfectly, until one Thursday evening in April changed everything. Every story like this has 2 families whose lives collide in an instant neither one saw coming. To understand what happened at the corner of Maple and 9th, you also have to understand the man standing on the other side of it. Dale Renner had been a police officer in Ridgefield for 6 years. On paper, his personnel file was unremarkable, a handful of commendations, an average performance review, no major disciplinary actions. He had a wife, 2 young kids of his own, and a reputation among his fellow officers as reliable, if a little quick-tempered on slow nights. What wasn't fully reflected in his official file were 3 separate community complaints filed over the previous 4 years, each one alleging that Renner had escalated minor interactions with black residents into confrontations that, according to the complainants, felt driven more by assumption than evidence. One complaint came from a black father who said Renner had questioned him for 20 minutes outside his own house, convinced, wrongly, that he'd witnessed a break-in in progress. Another came from a college student who said Renner searched his car during a traffic stop for a broken taillight, despite having no legal justification to do so. Each complaint had been reviewed by an internal affairs process that, at the time, required only a supervisor's signature to close a case as unsubstantiated. Each time, that's exactly what happened. No further review, no pattern flagged, no red flag in the system that might have changed the outcome of what happened next. On the Thursday evening in question, Renner was parked in his cruiser outside a convenience store on Route 9, 2 blocks from Maple Street, responding to a call that had come in 12 minutes earlier. The caller, a nervous overnight clerk who would later admit under oath that he'd glanced out the window for less than 3 seconds, reported 2 suspicious individuals near the store's parking lot, dressed in dark clothing, one of them carrying something in a bag. It was, in the most literal sense, a description that could have matched thousands of teenagers in Ridgefield on any given evening. It happened to also match 2 17-year-old girls in soccer jerseys, walking home with duffel bags slung over their shoulders after practice, 6 blocks from where the original call had even been placed. Renner ran the plates on 2 cars in the store's lot, found nothing, and was about to clear the call as unfounded when he spotted 2 figures crossing the intersection at 9th Street half a block away. Dark-colored jerseys, bags over their shoulders, walking with the kind of relaxed confidence that, to Renner, apparently read as something else entirely. He didn't call for backup. He didn't run the description past dispatch again to confirm a match. He pulled his cruiser forward, angled it toward the intersection, and stepped out. What happened over the next 90 seconds would later be replayed, frame by frame, in front of a grand jury, a federal review board, and eventually, a national television audience. Amara and Zuri were mid-conversation, laughing about a missed penalty kick during practice, when the cruiser's headlights swept across the intersection and came to a stop just ahead of them. "Stop right there!" Renner called out, stepping from the vehicle. His hand was already resting on his holster. A detailed body camera footage would later confirm was present from the very first second of the encounter, before either girl had said a single word. Amara turned first, more confused than afraid. 17 years of growing up in Ridgefield had never prepared her for this exact moment, but she'd had enough conversations with her father over the years. Conversations about respect, about compliance, about staying calm, no matter what, to know exactly how to respond. "Officer, we're just walking home from soccer practice," she said, raising her hands slightly, palms open. "This is our neighborhood. We live 4 blocks from here." I said stop. "Hands where I can see them. Both of you. They are where you can see them," Amara said, her voice steady, but her heart pounding. "We're not doing anything. Ma'am, I need you to stop talking and comply." Zuri, standing slightly behind her sister, felt the strap of her duffel bag begin to slip off her shoulder. The same duffel bag that had done this 100 times before during their walk home. The zipper long since worn loose from 3 seasons of cleats and shin guards bouncing around inside. She reached up, instinctively, to catch the strap before the bag hit the ground. It was, according to every piece of physical evidence later reviewed by investigators, nothing more than a 17-year-old girl adjusting a bag on her shoulder. It took less than 1 second. Renner would later testify that in that moment, he believed he saw a furtive movement consistent with someone reaching for a concealed weapon. He would testify that he feared for his life. He would testify that department training had conditioned him to respond to exactly this kind of perceived threat with immediate, decisive action. Body camera footage Renner believed, incorrectly, had malfunctioned and stopped recording earlier that shift after a hardware glitch flagged an error message on his equipment, captured a very different reality. 2 shots rang out across the quiet street, less than 2 seconds apart. Amara fell first, clutching her shoulder, a sound escaping her that neither she nor Zuri would ever fully be able to describe afterward. Zuri collapsed a heartbeat later, the duffel bag she'd reached to catch spilling open across the pavement. Shin guards, a half-empty water bottle, and a granola bar wrapper scattering across the asphalt in the same instant that a bullet tore through her collarbone. For a moment, the street was silent, except for the echo of the gunshots fading between rows of houses. Then the screaming started. A neighbor 2 houses down, a retired schoolteacher named Rosalind Pierce, who had lived on Maple Street for 31 years and knew both girls by name from watching them grow up on that block, came running from her porch, phone already in hand, dialing 911 before she'd even reached the sidewalk. "He shot them," she screamed into the phone, her voice barely coherent. "He shot 2 children, 2 girls. They were just walking home. They didn't do anything. Oh my God, somebody help them." Within 90 seconds, 3 more neighbors had emerged onto their porches. 2 more calls to 911 came in almost simultaneously, each describing, in growing horror, what they'd just watched an officer do to 2 teenage girls in soccer uniforms. Renner stood frozen for several seconds, his weapon still raised, before slowly lowering it and reaching for his radio. "Shots fired," he said, his voice tight. 2 subjects down, requesting immediate medical. He did not yet know their names. He did not yet know that the duffel bag he believed might have contained a weapon held nothing more than soccer gear. And he had absolutely no idea that within the hour he would learn exactly whose daughters he had just shot, and that the fallout would reach all the way to the top floors of the United States Department of Justice. 6 miles away, in an office on Pennsylvania Avenue, Marcus Whitfield was still working through a briefing folder on cartel prosecutions when his phone buzzed against his desk. The caller ID read, "Elena, home." He almost let it go to voicemail. It was 7:40 p.m., and Elena knew he was usually still in meetings until at least 8. He assumed it was a reminder about a dentist appointment or a question about weekend plans. He answered anyway. A habit, more than anything. A rule he'd made for himself since becoming a father, that no matter what meeting he was in, no matter how important the person across the table believed themselves to be, a call from his wife or daughters always got picked up. "Hey! Everything okay?" There was a pause on the other end that Marcus would later describe as the longest half-second of his life. "Marcus." Elena's voice cracked in a way he had never heard before. Not once in 19 years of marriage, not through 2 difficult pregnancies, not through her own father's death 6 years earlier. "It's the girls. They've been shot. Ridgefield Memorial. Come now. Please, just come now." Marcus doesn't remember standing up. He doesn't remember what happened to the briefing folder still open on his desk, or what he said to the staffer sitting across from him. Witnesses in the building that night would later describe him moving through the hallway at a dead run, the first time, in 3 years of working alongside him, that his security detail had ever had to sprint to keep pace with the Attorney General of the United States. The drive to Ridgefield Memorial took 11 minutes. Marcus would later say it felt like 11 hours. By the time he burst through the emergency room doors, federal agents were already arriving at the hospital, not because Marcus had called anyone, but because of a protocol that few outside of law enforcement leadership even knew existed. The moment a hospital's intake system flagged the surname Whitfield alongside a gunshot wound admission, an automatic notification triggered through the National Crime Information Center, alerting the U.S. Marshals Service, who are responsible for the safety of federal officials and their immediate families. Within 90 minutes of the shooting, the hallway outside the trauma unit at Ridgefield Memorial had filled with FBI field agents, officials from the Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General, representatives from the Virginia Attorney General's office, and a growing cluster of Ridgefield Police Department leadership, all trying to understand exactly what had happened and exactly how badly it was about to explode. Marcus pushed past all of them. He didn't care, in that moment, about jurisdiction, protocol, or the fact that half the people in that hallway were waiting for him to say something, anything, that they could relay up the chain. He cared about one thing: getting to his daughters. Elena was already there, having arrived minutes before him, standing outside the operating room where surgeons were working to stabilize Amara. A second team, in an adjacent operating room, was working on Zuri. "They're both alive," Elena told him, gripping his hand so hard her knuckles went white. "They're alive, Marcus. That's all I know. That's all anyone's telling me." Marcus Whitfield, a man who had stood in front of Senate confirmation hearings, who had prosecuted some of the most powerful and dangerous people in the country, who had built a career on staying composed under pressure that would break most people, sat down on the floor of that hospital hallway, put his head in his hands, and wept. Meanwhile, 2 blocks from the intersection where it had all begun, Officer Dale Renner was sitting in the back of a Ridgefield PD cruiser, writing his incident report by the dim glow of a laptop screen. He believed at that point that this was a routine use of force review, the kind that, in his 6 years on the force, had typically ended in a 2-week paid administrative leave and a quiet return to duty a month later. He had absolutely no idea what was already in motion. He found out an hour later, when his captain walked into the small conference room where he'd been waiting, face pale, hands visibly shaking, and said 4 words that would end Dale Renner's career before the ink on his own incident report had even dried. "You shot the Attorney General's daughters." By 11 p.m. that night, News vans had begun lining the streets outside Ridgefield Memorial. By midnight, the story had broken nationally, first as a vague wire report about an officer-involved shooting involving 2 minors, then, within 2 hours, with the detail that would change everything. The girls were the daughters of the sitting U.S. Attorney General. Inside the hospital, Amara came out of surgery first, just after midnight. The bullet had entered her shoulder and narrowly missed her lung, the width of a coin. The trauma surgeon would later tell Marcus and Elena, is the difference between what we're dealing with tonight and something far, far worse. Zuri's surgery took longer. The bullet had shattered a section of her collarbone, and doctors warned that she would likely need at least 2, possibly 3, follow-up surgeries over the coming months to fully repair the damage. She came out of the OR just before 2 a.m., stable, but in significant pain, her right arm immobilized in a sling that she would wear for the next several weeks. Marcus and Elena spent that first night in plastic chairs pulled up beside their daughters' hospital beds, neither of them sleeping, both of them simply watching the steady rise and fall of their daughter's breathing, as if committing it to memory. Outside, the investigation was already moving with a speed rarely seen in officer-involved shooting cases, a speed that, as later reporting would note, almost certainly would not have happened had the 2 girls not been who they were. That uncomfortable truth was not lost on Marcus, even in the depths of his own exhaustion and grief. I know why this case is moving fast, he told a small group of DOJ officials gathered outside his daughter's hospital room 2 days later. It's moving fast because of my last name, and that is exactly the problem I intend to spend the rest of my career fixing. Every family should get this level of scrutiny. Every family should get answers this quickly. Not just mine. Body camera footage from Renner's cruiser, footage he believed had failed to record, was recovered intact within 24 hours. It showed, unambiguously, 2 teenage girls with their hands raised, verbally identifying themselves, complying with instructions, in the seconds before Renner opened fire. It showed no weapon. It showed no lunge, no aggressive movement, nothing beyond a 17-year-old girl catching a slipping bag strap. The footage was reviewed by the Ridgefield police chief, the city's mayor, and a rapidly assembled independent panel within 48 hours. By the end of that review, Officer Dale Renner had been formally placed on unpaid leave, pending termination, a dramatically faster and more severe response than the department's own track record on prior use of force complaints against him. Community reaction was immediate and intense. Vigils formed at the corner of Maple and 9th, within hours of the shooting becoming public. Flowers, soccer balls, and handwritten signs began to accumulate at the intersection. Messages of support for Amara and Zuri, and, in growing numbers, demands for systemic accountability that went far beyond a single officer's actions. Rosalind Pierce, the neighbor who had made the first 911 call, gave an emotional interview to a local news crew 2 days after the shooting, standing at the very spot where she'd watched 2 girls she'd known since they were toddlers fall to the pavement. "I have known those girls their whole lives," she said, her voice breaking. "I watched them learn to ride bikes on this street. I do not care whose daughters they are. I care that this happened at all, to anybody's daughters, on a street where children should be safe." Her words, quoted in dozens of national outlets over the following days, became something of a rallying point for a broader conversation the shooting had reignited, one that extended well beyond the Whitfield family, into questions about the 3 prior community complaints against Renner that had never resulted in meaningful review, and about how many other officers, in how many other departments, might have similar patterns quietly buried in files that were never properly examined. Within a week, a special prosecutor was appointed to lead the case, a deliberate choice made to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest, given that the victims were the Attorney General's own daughters. Marcus formally recused himself and the entire Department of Justice from any direct involvement in the prosecution, a decision he insisted on, despite pressure from some advisors who felt his office should take a more active role. "The moment I use my position to influence this case," he told his chief of staff, "is the moment I've proven every critic of this system right. This has to be handled the way it would be handled for any family in this country. That's the only way it means anything. The special prosecutor, a veteran civil rights attorney named Dana Okafor, moved methodically through the case. Renner was indicted 3 weeks after the shooting on 2 counts of aggravated assault, 2 counts of reckless endangerment, and 1 count of filing a false police report. The latter charge stemming from inconsistencies between his written incident report and what the recovered body camera footage actually showed. The trial, when it finally began 5 months later, drew national media attention. Court sketch artists and television crews lined the street outside the Ridgefield County Courthouse each morning. Inside, the case unfolded over 11 days of testimony. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the body camera footage itself, footage that was played, frame by frame, for the jury, with an independent use-of-force expert walking through exactly what a reasonable, properly trained officer should have perceived in those final seconds before Renner fired. The expert testified that nothing in the footage supported a reasonable belief that either girl posed an imminent threat. There is a difference, the expert told the jury, between fear and justification. An officer can genuinely feel fear in a moment and still be objectively wrong about the threat in front of them. Training exists precisely to close that gap between perception and reality. In this case, that training failed, or wasn't followed. The defense argued that Renner had acted within the bounds of his training, that split-second decisions in the field could not fairly be judged with the benefit of hindsight and slow-motion video review, and that the ambiguous nature of the original 911 call had created a genuinely uncertain situation. The most emotionally difficult day of the trial came when Amara took the stand. 7 months removed from the shooting, her shoulder largely healed but still occasionally stiff in cold weather, she described, in steady and measured detail, exactly what she remembered from that evening. The confusion, the fear, watching her sister collapse beside her, and the sound of Officer Renner's voice as he called in the shooting without once, in those first critical moments, checking to see if either girl was still breathing. "I kept my hands up," she told the courtroom, her voice unwavering, even as tears streamed down her face. "I did everything right. I have replayed that moment 1,000 times, and there is nothing I could have done differently. The only thing that was wrong that night was his decision to pull the trigger." Zuri did not testify. Her attorneys and her parents made the difficult decision, in consultation with her own wishes, to spare her the trauma of reliving the shooting in open court, given that her physical recovery was still ongoing at the time of the trial. Her written victim impact statement was read into the record instead, describing months of physical therapy, sleepless nights, and a lingering fear of uniformed officers that she was working through with a therapist twice a week. After 11 days of testimony and just under 2 full days of jury deliberation, Officer Dale Renner was convicted on both counts of aggravated assault and the count of filing a false police report. He was acquitted on the reckless endangerment charges, which the jury found the prosecution had not sufficiently distinguished from the assault charges themselves. He was sentenced 4 months later to 7 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 4. Outside the courthouse following the verdict, Marcus Whitfield made his only extended public statement of the entire ordeal, standing beside Elena, with Amara, still not yet ready to speak publicly herself, standing quietly behind them. "This verdict does not undo what happened to my daughters," he said. "No verdict ever could. What it does is confirm what the evidence showed from the very first night, that 2 children did nothing wrong, and that the system, when it is forced to work properly, can still produce the right answer. My daughters are alive tonight because of surgeons, not because of the man who pulled the trigger. This case was never about my title. It was about every parent in this country who has ever had to wonder whether their child would make it home safely. Tonight, that fear had my last name attached to it. My hope, my real hope, is that we use this case to make sure it has no one's name attached to it, ever again." The city of Ridgefield, facing a federal civil rights lawsuit filed on behalf of Amara and Zuri, ultimately settled with the Whitfield family for $9.2 million, one of the largest police misconduct settlements in the state's history. In a decision that drew significant national attention, Marcus and Elena announced, 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized, that they would donate the entire amount to a newly established foundation, the Whitfield Family Foundation for Youth Justice, dedicated to funding independent police oversight boards, body camera compliance audits, and community mediation programs in underserved areas across 3 states. "We didn't need this money," Marcus said at the foundation's launch event, held not in Washington, but in a community center 2 blocks from the intersection where the shooting occurred. "What we needed, what every family in a situation like ours needs, is a system that doesn't require a tragedy like this to actually work. If this money can help build that system somewhere else, before another family has to go through what we went through, then something good will have come out of the worst night of our lives." At the federal level, the Department of Justice, under recommendation from an independent ethics panel specifically assembled to operate without Marcus's involvement, launched a nationwide review of body camera compliance standards and use of force training protocols. The review, completed 14 months later, led to updated federal guidance eventually adopted, in whole or in part, by police departments in more than a dozen states, including new requirements around mandatory body camera functionality checks at the start of every shift, and a standardized process for reviewing repeated community complaints against individual officers, regardless of whether prior complaints had been formally substantiated. Ridgefield's own police department underwent a broader restructuring in the year following the trial, including the appointment of an independent civilian oversight board with real subpoena power, a direct response to community advocacy that had gained significant momentum in the aftermath of the shooting, led in part by Rosalind Pierce, who became an outspoken advocate for police accountability reform in the months that followed, testifying before the Virginia state legislature twice. Officer Dale Renner, for his part, issued a single public statement through his attorney following his sentencing, expressing what he described as profound regret for the harm caused, while maintaining that he had genuinely believed, in the moment, that he was responding to a credible threat. He did not appeal his conviction. 8 months after the shooting, on a cool October evening, Amara and Zuri returned to the same soccer field where they'd played the practice session that preceded everything. Amara, still favoring her left shoulder slightly on cold days, wore the captain's armband for the first time that season, a decision made by her coach and unanimously supported by her teammates, several of whom had been standing on that same street corner the night everything happened. Zuri, whose collarbone had finally healed enough to allow full range of motion, scored the opening goal of their first home game in over a year, a moment the entire stadium rose to their feet for, though only a small fraction of the parents and students in the stands that evening knew the full weight of what that goal actually represented. Marcus and Elena sat in the stands like any other parents, cheering, filming shaky cell phone video, embarrassing their daughters slightly with how loud they got after Zuri's goal. For 90 minutes, in that stadium, they were not the Attorney General and a pediatric surgeon. They were just parents, watching their daughters do something they loved. Marcus never gave another extended interview about that night, beyond his statement outside the courthouse. When a journalist asked him, nearly a year later, why he had chosen relative silence over the extensive media platform available to him, he gave an answer that would later be quoted in profiles written about his tenure as Attorney General. "My daughters didn't survive that night so they could become a permanent headline," he said. "They survived so they could go back to being kids, to worrying about soccer practice and homework and whatever 17-year-olds are supposed to worry about, instead of what happened to them on a Thursday evening in April. That's the only kind of justice that ever really mattered to me. Not fame, not a media cycle, just my daughters getting their lives back." The intersection at Maple and 9th looks different today than it did that night. Following a request from neighbors, funded quietly by the city, without any involvement from the Whitfield family, a new streetlight now illuminates the corner that had been dim on the evening of the shooting. A small plaque near the base of the light reads simply, "For every child walking home." Amara graduated high school the following spring and enrolled in a pre-law program, telling a school newspaper reporter, in one of the only interviews she ever gave about that night, that she hoped to one day work in exactly the kind of civil rights law that had ultimately been responsible for holding Officer Renner accountable. Zuri, true to the interest that had defined her since 7th grade, pursued environmental science, eventually working summers with a coastal restoration non-profit. Though those who know her well say the quiet resolve she carries into every project traces directly back to a Thursday evening on Maple Street that she rarely discusses but has never forgotten. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, made you hopeful, or made you think twice about the world we're raising our children in, do 3 things for us right now. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what stayed with you the most, and subscribe so you never miss the next story of justice, resilience, and the fight for what's right. Stories like Amara and Zuri's remind us that real accountability is possible, but only when we demand it, for every family, every single time. We'll see you in the next one.